erupted, consuming everything. This story holds little for me now but the icy chill of remembered terror, the crushing weight of irrevocable acts. To others, reading this in the cold light of their own untroubled lives, it might seem a baroque fiction, a phantasm spun from a mind diseased by guilt. So be it. My aim is not persuasion, only to shed this suffocating burden before the final darkness claims me. The world can judge as it will, my only remaining concern is the telling, the unflinching exposure of the path I trod. But to grasp the utter darkness of the destination, one must first glimpse the faint light that preceded it. It strains credulity, even for me, sequestered here with only rats and regret for company, to recall that other Arthur, the man I was before the shadows grew teeth and learned my name. Therefore, let this grim narrative commence not with the gallows that await, but with the beginning, with the seemingly innocent days of youth and the early affections that would later become so hideously, monstrously warped. From my earliest childhood, I was marked by a peculiar softness, a profound sensitivity that set me apart. Adults called it docility, other children, less kind, found it a source of endless jest. My heart possessed a tenderness that bled readily. I recall weeping inconsolably over a fledgling fallen from its nest, spending an entire afternoon attempting to craft a splint for its minuscule, broken wing, much to the derision of my playmates. This inherent empathy, this almost painful connection to the vulnerability of living things, extended most powerfully towards animals. While other boys engaged in the rough-and-tumble cruelties of youth, I found true solace and uncomplicated companionship in the company of pets. My parents, a mixture of perplexed and perhaps relieved by my quiet nature, indulged this affinity, and our home gradually became a menagerie. We housed timid rabbits in the garden hutch, a cage of chirping finches by the window, later a gentle hound whose quiet loyalty mirrored my own disposition. These creatures were my confidants, the silent recipients of an affection I often struggled to articulate elsewhere. My happiest hours were spent simply being with them, observing their simple lives, feeding them, feeling the uncomplicated warmth of their trust. This connection to the brute creation wasn't merely a pastime, it felt essential, a defining trait that only intensified as I grew into manhood, becoming a principal, perhaps the purest, source of pleasure in my life. It seemed a continuation of this gentle fortune, then, when I met and married my dear Lenore. She was a woman of quiet grace and possessed a spirit wonderfully aligned with my own, or so I believed. She possessed a similar kindness, a serene temperament that understood, even shared, my affinity for domestic pets without question or ridicule. "Your heart is too soft for this world, Arthur," she'd say, though her eyes held warmth, not judgment. Observing my fondness, Lenore actively sought out creatures to bring into the sanctuary we were building together. Our modest dwelling, filled with the comforting sounds of life, the birds' cheerful songs, the soft patting of the aging hound on the floorboards, even the chattering antics of a mischievous small monkey she acquired from a traveling salesman, felt complete. Stable. A haven meticulously constructed against the harshness of the world, built on shared affection and the simple joys of quiet coexistence. Looking back now, from the damp stone embrace of this desolate cell, that period seems impossibly bright, bathed in a golden, dreamlike tranquility I can barely believe was ever real. And then came Pluto. He arrived not through purchase or conscious seeking, but materialized one rain-slicked evening on our doorstep, a creature of midnight first sleeked down by the storm, appearing as if summoned from the deepening twilight itself. He was a black cat, strikingly large, muscular beneath his sodden coat, and possessed of an unnerving beauty. Entirely black, without a single white hair to mar his coat, a perfect void in feline form. His eyes, large and unsettlingly intelligent, seemed to observe everything with an ancient, knowing gravity. From the moment I coaxed him inside, dried his shivering form, and offered him milk, a unique and powerful bond formed between us. While I cherished all our pets, Pluto became something more. My shadow, my constant, silent companion. It was I alone who fed him. He would follow me devotedly from room to room, winding around my ankles, a warm, vibrating presence. He often slept curled at the foot of my bed, a dark sentinel in the night. His devotion felt absolute, his focused affection palpable in a way the other animal's simpler attentions were not. He seemed to anticipate my moods, offering a silent, comforting weight against my leg during moments of quiet contemplation. Lenore, while fond of him, noted his intense attachment to me with a faint, almost playful unease. "Such a creature, Arthur," she once remarked lightly, watching him gaze steadily at me, "it almost makes one believe those old wives' tales, doesn't it? all black cats carrying a bit of the witch about them. She wasn't truly serious, of course, merely repeating a common superstition. I dismissed it easily then, with a condescending laugh perhaps, attributing his remarkable sagacity to mere instinct, a heightened feline awareness. Oh, the profound blindness of that contented fool I was. I dredge up her casual comment now only because, in the grim, unforgiving light of subsequent events, it echoes with a chilling, prophetic resonance. For several years, this deep affection, this seemingly uncomplicated friendship with Pluto, remained a cornerstone of my happiness, a seemingly unshakable pillar in the fragile edifice of my carefully constructed peaceful life. Our shared existence felt idyllic, secure, woven through with the comforting threads of mutual devotion, man, wife, and treasured pets, safe within our haven. Little did I suspect how vulnerable that edifice was, or how swiftly the rot, once introduced, could consume it all. Little did I suspect how vulnerable that edifice was, or how swiftly the rot, once introduced, could consume it all. For it was during this period, this seeming zenith of domestic contentment, that my character began its insidious, catastrophic transformation. I speak now, and the words scratch at my throat with the grit of shame even here, in this cold cell, of my descent into the suffocating clutches of the fiend intemperance. Alcoholism. A disease of the soul disguised as solace. It began subtly, almost innocuously. A glass of wine to soften the edges of the day, a measure of brandy by the fire, purported remedies against evening chills or fleeting anxieties. Innocent rituals, or so they seemed. But the habit grew, stealthily, like a parasitic vine, wrapping its insidious tendrils around my will, my judgment, my very soul. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, or perhaps I simply refused to perceive it, the poison took root and warped the very fabric of my being. That documented docility, the softness of heart that had once defined my youth, began to curdle, replaced by something volatile and mean. I found myself increasingly prone to bouts of inexplicable moodiness, long stretches of sullen, brooding silence punctuated by sudden, jarring fits of irritability over the most insignificant trifle. A misplaced book, a dropped stitch in Lenore's knitting, the cheerful chatter of the finches, anything could ignite a disproportionate flash of raw anger that left me trembling and bewildered in its wake. My regard for the feelings of others, once paramount, eroded day by day, replaced by a callous self-absorption. I remember one evening vividly, the turning point, perhaps, though I didn't recognize it then. Lenore was arranging flowers by the window, humming softly, a picture of the gentle grace that had first drawn me to her. Her quiet contentment, usually a balm, suddenly felt like a reproach. The simple melody grated on my nerves, amplified by the liquor singing its discordant tune in my veins. "Must you make that incessant noise?" I snapped, the harshness of my own voice a shock even to myself. The melody died on her lips. The hurt and confusion that flickered in her eyes, Lenore, always too quick to forgive, were a brief, sharp pang to what remained of my conscience. But the fiend whispered justifications, blaming fatigue, financial worries, anything but the drink that fueled the unprovoked cruelty. That gentle nature I once cherished in her now seemed, infuriatingly passive. Weak. My intemperate language became a household fixture, the verbal barbed sharper, driving wedges into the loving foundation of our marriage. And then, God forgive me, the threats began to manifest physically. There were moments, mercifully blurred now in the fog of intoxication, where words gave way to actions, an arm gripped too tightly, a slammed fist upon the table that made her flinch, the implicit threat of greater violence hanging heavy and toxic in the very air between us. A corrosive self-loathing grew within me, but it was a twisted thing, masked by drunken bravado and inevitably projected outwards as blame. She became too quiet, too watchful. The animals, my beloved pets, the innocent bystanders in my personal decline, inevitably felt the chill. The cages weren't cleaned as diligently, the old hound's pleas for affection were met with a gruff shove or a slurred curse. I began to neglect them, simple carelessness sliding into active ill-use. A kick aimed at the scuttling rabbits, a carelessly thrown object startling the birds into panicked flight, small, casual cruelties born of drunken frustration and a growing, generalized resentment. They learned to fear my heavy step, to shrink away when I entered a room reeking of spirits. All except one. For Pluto, my magnificent black cat, my shadow, I inexplicably retained a shred of my former affection, a lingering, perverse regard that initially stayed my hand from outright violence. Perhaps it was the depth of our established bond, a history too strong to be immediately broken. Perhaps his unnerving intelligence, those knowing eyes, gave me pause in my drunken haze. I made no scruple of maltreating the others when they crossed my path inopportunely, but Pluto remained strangely exempt. Or so I thought. But the disease, for what disease grips the soul so tightly as alcohol, continued its relentless work. My temper became fouler, my moments of genuine lucidity fewer. The core of goodness within me withered daily, starved by the constant intake of spirits that promised escape but delivered only deeper damnation. I was changing, warping into something monstrous, and the most terrifying part was how readily, how willingly, I embraced the transformation, seeking refuge from my inner turmoil in the very substance that created it. Even the last bastion of my original tenderness, my strange connection to the black cat, was beginning to crumble under the relentless assault. Even Pluto, now growing older and perhaps a little more querulous himself, started to sense the shift, his steady gaze now holding not just intelligence, but something akin to wary apprehension. His presence, once a comfort, began to feel like yet another irritation. The stage was being set for an atrocity I could scarcely have conceived of in my earlier days, an act that would tear the final veil from my decaying soul. That fragile, inexplicable restraint I held towards Pluto, already frayed thin by my accelerating intemperance and simmering irritability, was destined finally to snap. And snap it did, with a convulsive violence that still echoes in the hollow chambers of my memory, chilling me to the bone. It happened one night. Returning home late from some wretched, dimly lit tavern, thoroughly saturated with cheap gin, the world tilting precariously around me, I stumbled through the door into the oppressive silence of the house. Pluto, perhaps sensing the foul miasma of rage radiating from me, or maybe simply startled by my clumsy, lurching entrance, seemed to shy away as I advanced into the room. Avoidance. In my inflamed state, I perceived it as a deliberate slight, a calculated rejection from the one creature I still held, differently. Fueled by the cheap liquor and a sudden, volcanic surge of irrational anger, why did he look at me that way? I seized him. Roughly. In his understandable terror, he twisted, inflicting a slight, sharp scratch upon my hand with his teeth. A minor wound. Trivial. Utterly insignificant. But in that instant, the last fragile vestiges of the man named Arthur Penhaligon seemed to utterly vanish, consumed in flame. The fury of a demon, long simmering beneath the volatile surface of my liquor-sodden personality, erupted with incandescent force. I knew myself no longer, my original soul felt violently ejected from my body, instantly replaced by a more than fiendish malevolence, the spirit nurtured and amplified by the endless gin coursing through my veins. Every nerve, every fiber thrilled with a hideous, destructive energy. Reaching into my waistcoat pocket, my trembling hand closed around the familiar cool shape of a small penknife. I opened it. The blade gleamed dully. I grasped the poor, trembling beast, my once beloved companion, by the throat, ignoring his frantic struggles. And with a deliberate, horrific certainty that seemed to operate outside my own will, I carved one of his intelligent, watching eyes from its socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder even now, years later in this cold cell, as I pen the damnable atrocity. The act itself was a sickening blur of red against black fur, a quick, visceral violation that left me momentarily stunned, breathless, the tiny knife falling from my numb fingers. When morning eventually broke, gray and unforgiving, and the poisonous stupor of the night's debauch had somewhat lifted, leaving behind the usual pounding head and foul taste, a brief wave of something akin to remorse washed over me. A fleeting sentiment, half horror at the memory, half regret for the brutal crime I had committed. But it was a shallow, equivocal feeling at best. Feeble. Weak. My soul, it seemed, remained untouched, already too calloused over by drink and progressive degradation to register true repentance. The nascent guilt, the flicker of my former self, was eagerly extinguished. I plunged back into excess before the day was much older, seeking the familiar, welcome oblivion of wine to drown the searing, accusing memory of the deed and the sight of that ruined eye. Meanwhile, Pluto slowly, painfully, recovered. The empty socket was a gruesome spectacle, a constant, gaping accusation whenever I chanced to look his way, but he no longer seemed to be in acute physical pain. He moved about the house, wary now, a ghost of his former self. But whenever I drew near, he would flee in utter, abject terror. Understandable, of course. Who could blame him? Yet, while some small, buried part of my old heart initially felt a pang of grief at this evident, earned dread in a creature that had once so trustingly adored me, that feeling soon soured, curdling into irritation. Annoyance. Why must he constantly confront me with my own cruelty through his pathetic cowering? His fear became an insult, a reproach I could not bear. And then, rising from the sludge of my corrupted soul as if summoned by this festering irritation, came something else, something infinitely darker and more insidious, arriving as if for my final, irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. What is it, this chilling impulse? Philosophy ignores it, morality condemns it, yet who can deny its existence? Is it not a fundamental, albeit shadowy, faculty of the human heart? Who has not, 100 times perhaps, found himself committing a vile or merely foolish act for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Do we not possess within us a perpetual inclination, often flying directly in the face of our best judgment, to violate that which is law, simply because we understand it to be the law? This spirit, this inscrutable, unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to deliberately embrace wrong purely for the wrong's sake, this took hold of me then. It whispered insidious suggestions in the rare quiet moments between drunken bouts. It insisted that the initial injury, the eye-gouging, was somehow incomplete, insufficient. It demanded a final, terrible consummation. So, one morning, bathed not in drunken fury but in the cold, sober light of day, I acted upon this perverse urging. With tears streaming down my face, yes, actual tears. And with the bitterest, most genuine remorse clawing at my heart like a physical pain, I slipped a prepared noose around Pluto's sleek black neck. I led him, unresisting now, perhaps sensing the finality, out into the neglected garden, towards a sturdy tree limb hanging low over the weeds. And I hung him. Hung him deliberately, methodically, precisely because I knew, with absolute certainty, that he had loved me, devotedly and without reservation. Hung him because I felt, deep down, that he had given me no true reason for offense beyond his understandable fear of the monster I had become. Hung him because I knew, with chilling clarity, that in doing so, I was committing a sin, a deadly, unforgivable sin. An act of such profound and calculated wickedness that it would surely jeopardize my immortal soul, placing it, if such a desperate thing were even possible, utterly beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. I stood there for a long moment, the rope taut, the small body limp and still, the full, crushing weight of my irreversible damnation settling upon me like a shroud. That very night, the night of the day this calculated, cruel deed was done, I was violently torn from a shallow, troubled sleep by a frantic cry that pierced the suffocating darkness of my room. That frantic cry, fire, ripped through the thick, oppressive air of the night, mere hours after my calculated, cold-blooded act of cruelty in the garden. It seemed the very elements conspired against me. I awoke choking, the room thick with acrid smoke. The curtains of my bed, inexplicably, were already ablaze, casting flickering, demonic shadows on the walls. Flames licked greedily at the doorframe, consuming the house with terrifying speed. Panic, raw and primal, seized our small household. It was only with the greatest difficulty, stumbling through the blinding smoke and searing heat, gasping for air, that my wife, Lenore, our single elderly servant, Martha, and myself managed somehow to escape the devouring inferno. We stood outside on the dew-soaked lawn, shivering despite the heat, watching helplessly as the entire structure became engulfed, roaring like some hungry beast intent on oblivion. The destruction was absolute, swift, and terrifyingly complete. Everything I owned, my entire worldly wealth, meager as it had become through neglect and my expenditures on drink, was swallowed up by the flames in a matter of hours. I resigned myself then forward to utter, bottomless despair, another, more public layer of ruin added to my already crumbling, self-inflicted existence. My home, my haven, reduced to smoldering ashes. I attempt to remain above the weakness, I think, of seeking to establish a direct, superstitious sequence of cause and effect between the atrocity I committed against Pluto in the garden and this sudden, devastating disaster. Perhaps it was merely faulty wiring, neglected upkeep. Yet, I am detailing a chain of facts as they occurred, and I wish to leave no possible link, however tenuous or seemingly irrational, unexamined in this final confession. The day after the fire, compelled by some morbid curiosity, I returned to the scene. The ruins smoked sullenly under a bleak, gray sky. Walls had collapsed inward, leaving a jumbled, blackened mess of charred timbers, broken furniture, and sodden debris. It was a scene of utter devastation. But one portion, strangely, miraculously, remained standing, an interior compartment wall, not particularly thick, located near the middle of the house. Against this very wall, I recalled with a jolt, the head of my bed had rested. The plastering here had, in large measure, resisted the intense action of the fire, a fact I initially, perhaps foolishly, attributed to its having been recently applied during some minor repairs and perhaps not fully cured by the damp atmosphere of the old house. Around this single surviving wall, a dense crowd had already gathered, despite the early hour. People were murmuring, pointing, examining one particular section with minute and eager, almost morbid, attention. Snatches of conversation drifted towards me, words like strange, singular, unbelievable, piquing my own curiosity despite the heavy weight of my desolation. I pushed closer through the onlookers, drawn by an invisible current, and then I saw it. Etched, seared, impossibly imprinted, as if graven in stark bas-relief upon the white plaster surface, was the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was rendered with an accuracy that was truly marvelous, preternaturally precise. And there, around the animal's neck, stark against the white, was the unmistakable, damning outline of a rope. When I first beheld this impossible apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and terror were extreme, battling for supremacy within my reeling mind. My blood ran cold, the hairs on my neck prickled. Was this divine judgment made manifest? But after the initial, paralyzing shock, rational thought, or what passed for it in my degraded state, came, however imperfectly, to my aid. The cat, Pluto, I remembered with sudden clarity, had been hung in the garden adjacent to the house. Upon the first alarm of fire, the garden must have been instantly filled by the aroused neighbors and onlookers. Surely, someone among them must have cut the animal down from the tree, perhaps out of some misplaced pity, or merely morbid curiosity, and then, possibly intending to arouse me from my sleep, thrown it through an open window into my chamber. Then, the subsequent collapse of other, heavier walls would have violently compressed the poor victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster on the standing partition. The lime of the plaster, combined with the intense, penetrating heat of the flames and, perhaps, the ammonia released from the rapidly decomposing carcass, must have somehow combined to accomplish the ghastly, accusatory portraiture I now witnessed. A freakish confluence of natural events. Yes, that must be it. Although I thus readily constructed an explanation satisfactory to my reason, if not entirely soothing to my deeply unsettled conscience, the startling image nonetheless made a profound and haunting impression upon my fancy. For months afterwards, try as I might, I could not rid my mind of the phantasm of the cat. The image intruded upon my waking thoughts and stalked my increasingly troubled dreams. During this period, haunted and adrift, a peculiar half-sentiment returned to my spirit, something that seemed like remorse, but perhaps was merely a selfish regret for the loss of a familiar presence, however tormented our relationship had become. I found myself actually lamenting the loss of the animal, the absence of its dark, silent form. And so, driven by this strange mix of guilt and loneliness, I began to look about me, actively searching among the vile haunts, the dismal taverns and squalid dens of infamy which I now habitually frequented, the only society I felt fit for another pet of the same species, and, if possible, of somewhat similar appearance, with which to replace the one I had so monstrously destroyed. One particularly wretched night, sitting half stupefied in the corner of such a den, the air thick with cheap gin fumes and despair, my bleary attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense, damp hogsheads of gin or rum that constituted the chief furniture of the squalid apartment. I had been staring blankly in that direction for some minutes, lost in a drunken haze. I approached it slowly, peered through the gloom, and reached out a hesitant hand, touched it. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto had been, and closely, unnervingly resembling him in nearly every respect save one that I could immediately discern. I saw instantly, with a jolt that momentarily sobered me, that this cat, like my murdered Pluto, had also been deprived of one of its eyes. The raw, empty socket stared back at me from the gloom. Upon my touching him there in that dimly lit, foul-smelling den, the creature immediately arose, stretched languidly, and, far from taking fright, began to purr loudly, rubbing insistently against my hand. He seemed utterly, almost unnaturally, delighted with my notice. This, then, perhaps providentially delivered, was the very creature of which I was in search. A replacement. A chance, maybe, for some twisted form of atonement? The landlord, a slovenly man wiping his hands on a stained apron, merely shrugged when I inquired about the animal, making no claim to it, knowing nothing of it, swearing he had never seen it before. Strange. I continued my hesitant caresses, and when I eventually rose to leave, heading back to the squalid, cheap lodgings our poverty now compelled us to inhabit since the fire, the animal immediately evidenced a clear, unwavering disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, finding myself occasionally, almost unconsciously, stooping and patting it as I proceeded through the dark, narrow streets. When it reached the miserable rooms that now served as home, it domesticated itself at once, exploring with an unnerving confidence. And, perhaps unsurprisingly given her inherent kindness and perhaps a loneliness deepened by my own descent, the cat became immediately a great favorite with my wife, Lenore. That missing eye, the very feature which struck me with such profound, superstitious unease, only seemed to endear the creature further to her gentle heart, a focus for her pity. For my own part, however, a deeply unsettling reaction began almost immediately. I soon found a profound dislike to it arising within me, entirely contrary to my initial intentions. This was the very reverse of what I had anticipated upon finding it, but, I know not how or why it was, some instinctive revulsion perhaps, it's evident, almost fawning fondness for myself served only to disgust and intensely annoy me. By slow, insidious degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance festered, growing stronger daily, rising eventually into the corrosive bitterness of intense, irrational hatred. I began actively to avoid the creature, shuddering when it brushed against me. Its very presence became a constant, grating irritant, a black, one-eyed reminder of things I desperately wished to forget. Yet, paradoxically, a certain residue of shame, coupled with the vivid, chilling remembrance of my former deed of cruelty against Pluto, prevented me for some weeks from physically abusing this new arrival. I did not strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, though the urge often rose hot and sudden within me. But gradually, very, very gradually, I came to look upon it with an unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious, constant presence as one might flee from the breath of a pestilence. What added, no doubt, exponentially to my burgeoning hatred of the beast was a specific discovery, made casually on the morning after I brought it home. Pluto, my former companion, had been flawless ebony, without a single white hair upon any portion of his body. But this cat, this uncanny, one-eyed successor, possessed a large, although initially indistinct and ill-defined, splotch of white fur covering nearly the whole region of its breast. This was the one discernible difference. And yet, perversely, as my aversion to this creature grew, its own inexplicable partiality for myself seemed only to increase, intensifying my resentment and feeding my growing dread. It followed my footsteps with a dogged, unnerving pertinacity which it would be difficult to adequately convey. Whenever I sat, it would immediately crouch beneath my chair, or, worse, spring unexpectedly upon my knees, covering me with what felt like its loathsome, suffocating caresses. If I arose to walk, it would invariably get between my feet, nearly tripping me, or, fastening its long and remarkably sharp claws in my clothing, clamber insistently in this manner up towards my breast, purring loudly all the while. At such times, although I longed with every fiber of my being to destroy it with a single, swift blow, I was yet withheld from doing so. Partly, it was still the nagging memory of my former crime, a ghost of guilt clinging stubbornly. But chiefly, let me confess it at once, here in the final hours, I was held back by an absolute dread of the beast. This dread, it was not exactly a dread of physical evil, though the creature was large and potentially vicious. No, it was something deeper, more insidious, something I struggled then, and struggle now, to define. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even here in this condemned felon's cell, awaiting the hangman's rope, I am almost physically ashamed to own that the terror and horror with which the animal increasingly inspired me had been heightened, amplified beyond reason, by one of the merest, most fantastic chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife, Lenore, in her innocence, had called my attention, more than once, to the peculiar character of that mark of white hair upon the creature's breast, the sole visible difference, besides the missing eye, between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. As I mentioned, this mark, although large, had been originally quite vague and indefinite in its form. But by slow degrees so subtle, so nearly imperceptible, that for a long time my own struggling reason fought to reject the notion as fanciful, a product of my frayed nerves and guilty conscience, it had at length assumed a rigorous, terrifying distinctiveness of outline. It was now, unmistakably, the representation of an object that I shudder, even now, to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself instantly of the monster whose presence tormented me, had I only possessed the courage. It was now, I say, the perfect image of a hideous, of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. Oh, mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. And now was I indeed wretched beyond the common wretchedness of mere humanity. To be haunted so. A brute beast, whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed in a fit of drunken perversity, a brute beast now set, it seemed, to work out for me, a man supposedly fashioned in the image of the high God, so much of intolerable, insufferable woe. Alas! Neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the daylight hours, the creature left me no single moment alone, its silent, one-eyed gaze a constant reproach, and, in the darkness, I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear, visions of judgment, of ropes, of falling, only to find the hot, fetid breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast, suffocating weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my very heart. The relentless pressure of torments such as these, day after day, night after night, began finally grinding down the last feeble remnant of the good left within my corrupted soul. Beneath the relentless pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me finally, irrevocably, succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts, circling like vultures in my tormented mind. The brooding moodiness of my usual temper intensified, metastasizing into a simmering hatred of all things and, indeed, of all mankind. While from the sudden, frequent, and utterly ungovernable outbursts of a savage fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, my gentle Lenore, alas! became the most usual, and always the most patient, of sufferers. How she bore it, I cannot fathom. Perhaps love blinded her, or perhaps fear. One day, she accompanied me upon some necessary household errand into the damp, musty cellar of the old, dilapidated building which our deepening poverty now compelled us to inhabit. The cat, the source of so much of my escalating misery, inevitably followed me down the steep, treacherous stairs, its silent tread unnervingly close behind. Near the bottom, it darted suddenly between my feet, causing me to stumble violently, nearly throwing me headlong down the remaining steps. This final, simple annoyance, piled upon months of festering hatred and sleepless torment, exasperated me instantly to utter madness. Uplifting a short-handled axe which rested nearby against the damp stone wall, left there from some forgotten shore, and completely forgetting, in the sudden, white-hot volcanic eruption of my wrath, the childish, superstitious dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a vicious blow at the animal. A blow which would certainly have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested. Arrested by the hand of my wife. Lenore cried out, "Arthur, no!" and threw herself forward, her small hand closing over my wrist. Goaded by this interference, this final frustration, into a rage more than demoniacal, a fury that eclipsed all reason, all memory of love or caution, I violently withdrew my arm from her grasp. And I turned upon her, and buried the axe deep in her brain. She fell instantly, heavily, upon the damp earthen floor of the cellar. Dead upon the spot. There was not even a groan to mark her passing. Just silence. This hideous murder accomplished, the blinding rage subsided as quickly as it had flared, replaced almost instantly by a chilling, preternatural calm. I set myself forthwith, and with entire, cold deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. The immediate, ghastly necessity drove out all other thoughts. My mind, strangely clear now, worked with methodical precision. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I could not remove the corpse from the house, either by day or by night, without incurring the unacceptable risk of being observed by the neighbors in our close-set street. Many gruesome projects entered my mind as I stood there, staring down at the still form in the gloom. At one period I considered cutting the corpse into minute fragments, and destroying them piece by piece in the meager kitchen fire upstairs. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it right there, in the soft earth floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated briefly about casting it, weighted down, into the disused well in the small, weed-choked yard, or perhaps even packing it crudely into a large shipping box, labeling it as merchandise, and arranging for a common porter to unwittingly take it away from the house. Finally, however, after careful consideration in that silent, death-filled cellar, I hit upon what I considered a far better, safer expedient than any of these. I determined to wall it up within the cellar itself, recalling dimly tales of how the monks of the Middle Ages were recorded to have walled up their inconvenient victims within monastery walls. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was almost perfectly adapted. Its walls were rather loosely constructed of rough stone and brick, and had, in places, been relatively recently plastered over with a coarse lime plaster, which the perpetual dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening completely. Moreover, in one of the walls, near where the body lay, there was a distinct projection, caused by a disused, false chimney or fireplace, one that had been filled up sometime in the past, and crudely plastered over to resemble the rest of the cellar wall. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, carefully insert the corpse into the resulting cavity, and then wall the whole thing up precisely as it was before, so that no prying eye, however suspicious, could detect anything amiss. And in this grim calculation, I was not deceived. By means of a heavy crowbar, found resting among other neglected tools, I easily dislodged the old bricks, creating a sufficient opening. Having carefully, almost tenderly, it felt in that strange, detached state, deposited the body against the inner wall of the cavity, I managed to prop it upright in that position while, with surprisingly little trouble, I painstakingly relayed the entire structure of bricks just as it had originally stood. Having then procured mortar, sand, and some coarse hair from an old horsehair mattress stored nearby, mixing them carefully to match the old texture, I prepared, with every possible precaution against discovery, a new batch of plaster which could not, I judged, be distinguished from the original rough coating. And with this, I very carefully, meticulously, went over the entire surface of the new brickwork. When I have finally finished, stepping back to observe my handiwork in the dim light, I felt a profound, chilling satisfaction. All was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been recently disturbed. With painstaking care, I gathered up every speck of loose mortar, every fallen chip of brick or plaster from the floor. I looked around the silent cellar, almost triumphantly, and said quietly to myself, "Here at last, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next immediate step, after that grim, perverse satisfaction settled upon completing the wall, was to look again, with murderous intent, for the beast which had been the ultimate cause of so much wretchedness, for I had, at length, firmly resolved to put it to death without delay. Had I been able to meet with it at that moment, directly after concealing my wife's corpse, there could have been no doubt of its immediate fate. But it appeared that the crafty animal, perhaps alarmed by the sheer violence of my previous outburst during the murder of poor Lenore, and sensing the lingering rage, had wisely chosen to make itself scarce. It was nowhere to be found in the cellar or the rooms above. It is impossible now to describe, or even perhaps to fully imagine, the deep, the truly blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. Its non-appearance felt like a reprieve, a lifting of the dreadful weight. It did not return during the night, and thus for one night, at least, since its malevolent introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. Incredibly, I slept deeply, even with the fresh burden of murder heavy upon my soul. The second and the third day passed in a haze of anxious quiet, and still my tormentor, the one-eyed cat, came not. Once again, foolishly, I began to breathe as a freeman. The monster, surely, in sheer terror, had fled the premises forever. I should behold its accusing gaze, its gallows-marked breast, no more. My happiness, perverse and ill-founded, was almost supreme. The actual guilt of my dark deed disturbed my thoughts surprisingly little in those few days. The immediate fear of discovery overshadowed any pangs of conscience. Some few inquiries, of course, had been made regarding Lenore's sudden disappearance, but these had been readily, smoothly answered with lies about a sudden journey. Even a cursory search of the house had been instituted by concerned neighbors, but, naturally, nothing was discovered. My careful handiwork in the cellar held firm. I foolishly looked upon my future felicity, my freedom, as absolutely secured. Upon the fourth day after the assassination, however, a party of the police came very unexpectedly into the house, summoned perhaps by lingering suspicions, and proceeded again to make a new, far more rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the utter inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. Indeed, a strange confidence filled me. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored, their methodical examination thorough and unnerving. At length, for the third or fourth time during their search, they descended once more into the cellar. I quivered not in a single muscle. My heart, astonishingly, beat calmly, evenly, as that of one who slumbers in blessed innocence. I walked the cellar casually from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom, affecting boredom, and roamed easily, idly, to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied, it seemed. They found nothing suspicious. They prepared to depart. The glee, the triumphant relief swelling in my heart was too strong, too potent to be restrained. I burned to say if but one word, just one syllable, by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my complete guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, my voice smooth, almost jovial, as the party ascended the cellar steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health, and perhaps a little more courtesy in future dealings. By the by, gentlemen," I added, gesturing expansively, this is a very well-constructed house." In the rabid, uncontrollable desire to say something nonchalant, something easy, I scarcely knew what nonsense I uttered at all. "I may say," I continued, stepping forward, "an excellently well-constructed house. These walls, are you going, gentlemen, these walls, you see, are solidly put together." And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, unable to stop myself, I rapped heavily, with a sturdy walking cane which I held in my hand, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the archfiend. No sooner had the reverberations of my foolish blows sunk into the damp silence of the cellar, than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, answered by a cry, at first muffled and broken, indistinct, like the terrified sobbing of a lost child, and then quickly swelling, escalating into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a prolonged howl, a horrific, wailing shriek, vibrating with both terror and a dreadful, unearthly triumph. Such a sound as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their eternal agony and of the very demons that exult in that damnation. Of my own thoughts at that moment, it is folly to speak. Utterly undone, swooning, I staggered back against the opposite wall. For one dreadful instant, the party of police upon the stairs remained utterly motionless, paralyzed by the extremity of sheer terror and unnatural awe. In the very next instant, however, a dozen stout arms were furiously toiling at the wall. It resisted briefly, then gave way. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood horribly erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its ravaged head, with red, extended mouth and solitary eye of raging fire, sat the hideous beast, the second cat, whose craft, whose presence had seduced me into the final act of murder, and whose informing, damnable voice now consigned me, irrevocably, to the hangman. In my frantic haste, in my mad focus on the wall itself, I had walled the monster up within the tomb alongside my victim. And so, my confession finds its end, here in this final darkness, awaiting the grey dawn and the inevitable executioner's rope.